Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
Tethys Minor Way Station had a smell. Every station had a smell, but most stations had the decency to let theirs develop organically over time, through accumulated human habit and mechanical aging, and the slow negotiation between recycled air and organic life. Tethys Minor had skipped that process entirely and arrived, as if by administrative decision, at an odor that suggested three things simultaneously: coolant, regret, and a protein-based food product that had been described on its packaging as satisfying by someone who had clearly never been required to eat it. Eli Vane had been here 4 times in his career, and each time the smell hit him at the docking hatch like an old acquaintance who had not improved. He was supposed to be here for 40 minutes. Fuel, a log update, and back into the black with his cargo of compressed agricultural data arrays, 12 canisters of soil composition records, and seasonal yield projections that some farming consortium on the Hessian side needed, and was paying him adequately, if not generously, to deliver. It was the kind of work that kept a man alive and philosophically neutral. He had been doing it for 11 years. The Orvantine settled into Bay 7 with the familiar groan of a ship that had made the transition from vacuum to pressurized dock a few thousand times and had opinions about it. She was a mid-body freighter, built 2 decades ago by a manufacturer that no longer existed under that name, and she had the particular quality of aging machinery that has been maintained with genuine attention, not beautiful, not new, but honest. The port stabilizer, which had been humming a half-tone flat since Purdy's station, dropped to silence when the landing sequence completed. The silence was, as always, too large for the cabin. Eli filed his dock log, authorized the fuel line, and decided that 40 minutes was enough time to get something from the common area that wasn't the protein medley. He was wrong about this, but optimism in small doses had sustained better men than him. It was on his way back, carrying a beverage the dispenser had identified as citrus-adjacent, and which tasted primarily of ambition, that he walked through Bay 9 and saw her. She was sitting on a cargo crate with the stillness of someone who had graduated past anger and arrived somewhere on the other side of it, into a patience that had a harder, more deliberate quality than peace. Her wrap was deep gray, practical, the kind a person buys when they understand weather systems. She looked human enough at first glance that his eyes moved past her, then returned, in the way they do when something registers just below the threshold of articulation. The second look took longer. Her skin held a faint iridescence that only appeared at certain angles, there, then gone, then there again as the bay's overhead panels shifted through their automated cycle. Her eyes were dark and ringed at the outer edge with a thin band of silver gold, and her fingers, resting on her knees with the particular care of someone waiting for something to be over, were fractionally too long. Not alarmingly so. Just enough that the eye noted it quietly, the way a person notes a room has one window fewer than expected. She had one bag. It sat beside her with a lightness that suggested it was either very well packed or a decoy. Eli stood there for a moment with his citrus-adjacent beverage. Bay 9 was otherwise empty. The overhead recyclers clicked through their cycle. Somewhere deeper in the station, something that should have been silent was producing a low, intermittent sound that maintenance had presumably been informed about and had presumably not found time to address. He was not, by his own accounting, a man who introduced himself to strangers without reason. He was also not a man who could plausibly claim, standing 12 feet from someone who had clearly been in that spot long enough for it to have become a situation, that no reason existed. He walked over. She looked up without surprise, which itself was slightly surprising. He said his name. She said hers was Sierra simply, as if she'd decided on it recently and found it serviceable. She told him her transport had suffered a critical drive failure 2 days prior, that the salvage claim was filed, and that the compensation process was, she chose to say, ongoing. She said the word ongoing with a particular flatness that communicated a vast and detailed frustration without technically expressing one, in the way that only people who have spent serious time navigating serious administrative structures learn to speak about administrative structures. A berth from Tethys Minor to anywhere reasonable, she said, cost more than she had conveniently liquid. The next scheduled carrier with passenger accommodation was 11 days out. Eli looked at the bay. He looked at the crate she was sitting on, which had been stenciled with the name of a freight company that had gone into receivership 3 years ago. He thought about 11 days at Tethys Minor, which was the kind of thought that generated a sympathy both genuine and slightly self-referential, because he had once spent 6 days here waiting on a parts delivery, and had nearly begun talking to the fuel line couplings for company. He told her he was headed to Hessen Hub. 3 days. He had a second berth that was technically a storage room, but could be cleared to something habitable if she didn't object to a box of outdated nav charts where a wardrobe would ideally be. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully map. Then she said it sounded fine, and thank you, and meant it in the precise and particular way of someone for whom gratitude was not casual. He said it was no trouble. She smiled at something in that briefly to herself more than to him. He didn't ask what was funny. He picked up her bag, it was, indeed, nearly weightless, and walked her back through the station toward Bay 7, past the common area where the protein medley sat undisturbed in its warming tray, having long since accepted that no one was coming. The Orvantine had a particular way of expressing her feelings about having a second person aboard, and that way was thermal. The life support system, designed with the comfortable assumption that one human body would be generating heat and respiration at any given time, responded to 2 bodies the way an old building responds to unexpected guests, with a series of small, pointed adjustments that communicated awareness without quite achieving welcome. The cabin ran 2 degrees warmer than usual on the first day. The recyclers kicked up a register, and at one point the environmental panel displayed a readout that Eli had never seen before, a yellow advisory that said occupancy variance detected, which he dismissed, and which the ship, in its way, accepted with the dignity of a complaint that had been registered and filed. Sierra said nothing about any of this. She had settled into the second berth with a self-sufficiency that suggested she was either accustomed to difficult conditions or had the kind of internal resources that made external conditions secondary. She ate what the galley offered without comment, the galley's best effort at this juncture being a heated grain composite that Eli genuinely liked and had always suspected was an outlier opinion, and she slept at hours that didn't quite align with the ship's artificial cycle, which meant that occasionally Eli emerged from the cockpit at odd intervals to find her awake and reading at the small console table, with the focused attention of someone for whom reading was not leisure so much as a separate and serious occupation. He didn't interrupt. She didn't explain. The first day had the careful, padded quality of 2 people managing proximity without yet having determined what kind of proximity it was going to be. Eli ran his standard transit checks, updated his cargo log, listened to the port stabilizer, which had resumed its flat-toned hum now that the Orvantine was back in the vacuum, and therefore had something to say again. He ate at the cockpit console. Sierra appeared once to ask if there was anything she could help with, and when he said no, she nodded and returned to her berth, and that was the first day. The second day opened with her asking about the book. It was sitting on the console where he'd left it the night before. A physical paperback, actually paper, actually bound, the kind of object that required a specific sequence of decisions to own in an era when all the same information existed in formats that occupied no physical space whatsoever. The cover showed water and sky and a vessel of some kind in a situation that was not going well. She picked it up with both hands, turned it over, read the back, and turned it to the front again in the manner of someone conducting a small and thorough investigation. She asked if it was old. He said early 21st century, which in the current calendar made it roughly 400 years back. She asked if humans had been writing this kind of story, catastrophe, ocean, survival, for a long time before that. He said probably since they first built boats, which was his genuine opinion, and also the kind of sentence he had never had occasion to say to anyone, because most of the people he knew who read books read them on screens and had no interest in the question of why books existed. She considered this with a seriousness the subject perhaps merited. Then she said she thought it was interesting that a species would choose, repeatedly and across centuries, to tell stories about being in the wrong place when everything failed. She said it with the tone of someone who found it genuinely interesting rather than worrying, which he appreciated. He said he thought it was because being in the wrong place when everything failed was also, secretly, the situation in which a person found out the most about what they actually were. The comfortable version of a person was easy. The version that emerged at the far edge of a disaster, cold and making decisions, that one was harder to perform. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Yes, that's exactly it." She said it in a way that made him feel he'd said something true rather than something clever, which were different feelings, and the first was considerably better. They talked for most of the afternoon. She had positions on human literature that were too specific to be casual. She knew not just titles but arguments, not just periods but the internal debates within those periods, the way a serious student knows a field. She thought the science fiction of the 20th century had done something the later centuries hadn't managed, which was to be genuinely afraid of what it was imagining. She said writers who lived inside the futures they described had lost the productive discomfort of speculation. The fear was gone, she said, and without the fear the ideas had become furniture instead of windows. Eli said he'd never thought about it that way. She said that was fine, it was a fairly specific complaint. He asked how she had ended up with such specific complaints about human literary history. She said she traveled a great deal and read to pass the time, which was true in the way that describing an ocean as some water is true, not inaccurate, simply operating at a significant distance from the scale of the actual thing. He accepted it. People carried their backgrounds at whatever angle they chose, and it wasn't his business to ask her to tilt hers differently. It was later, the ship's panels dimming toward their approximation of evening, the grain composite finished, two containers of something the galley called brood sitting on the console table between them, that she began talking about the transit authority of her home system, and this was where the day changed register entirely. She began with the forms. There were, she explained, with a precision that could only come from direct and repeated experience, 17 forms involved in filing a distress transport claim in her home system. Not 17 steps. 17 distinct forms, each with its own submission window, its own required attachments. And this was the part she delivered with the flat affect of someone who had decided the only dignified response to absurdity was absolute calm. Its own definition of what constituted acceptable proof of the event, the other 16 forms were also about. Eli asked if they at least cross-referenced each other. She looked at him. She said, that would imply the departments responsible for each form were aware of each other's existence, which the filing system's architecture strongly suggested they were not. He laughed. She watched him laugh with an expression that started as wry and became, around the edges, something less guarded, the way a door opens a little more when the first opening didn't result in anything alarming. She told him about Form 7 Provisional, which required the signature of the original transport's licensed operator, who was, she gestured gently at the concept of a ship that had experienced critical drive failure, not currently in a position to sign anything. She told him about the appeals process for Form 7 Provisional, which required the submission of Form 7 Provisional in order to begin. She let that sit in the air between them. He put his container down. He said, "So you need the form to appeal the form." She said, You need the completed form to appeal the requirement for the completed form, yes, and that she wanted to be precise about that because the distinction mattered, and the people who designed it had clearly felt it did too. He laughed hard enough that the Orvantine's proximity sensor, which was sensitive to sudden movement, emitted a single polite chime and then went quiet, apparently deciding nothing was wrong. She smiled at that, properly this time, with her whole face, and something in the set of her shoulders changed by a degree or two, a small, structural relaxation, the kind a person doesn't notice they've been holding until they stop. Outside the forward port, the stars continued their business, indifferent and brilliant and very far apart. The third day arrived the way third days on long hauls always did, with the quiet authority of something that had been patient and was now simply present. Eli had done enough transit runs to know the particular quality of a journey's final leg, the way the ship felt subtly different when the destination had shifted from abstract to actual, from a coordinate on a chart to a place that existed and was getting closer at a rate that mattered. The Orvantine hummed along in the register she reserved for open stretches of nothing, which was her most contented register, and the port stabilizer contributed its half-tone flat, and somewhere in the cargo hold the data arrays sat in their casings being agricultural and uncomplicated, and outside the forward port the stars held their positions with the commitment of things that had nowhere else to be. Sierra was awake before him. She had made something in the galley that she called an approximation of a morning drink from her system, which she had constructed from the galley's available supplies, with the focused ingenuity of someone who had improvised in worse kitchens. It was dark and smelled of something burnt, and something herbal, and something that had no analog he could name. She offered him a container. He accepted it in the spirit in which it was offered and drank a cautious amount, and said it was good, which was 30% accurate and 100% polite. She said it was better back home. He said he believed that entirely. They had, by the third day, developed the specific ease of people who have decided without discussing it that the situation they're in is a good one, and that drawing attention to its temporary nature would be poor manners toward it. They sat at the console table. The light through the forward port did what deep space light did in the early ship cycle, came from everywhere and nowhere, sourceless, the particular illumination of a universe that hadn't organized its lighting around human morning. Sierra had her device open and was reading something she didn't describe, and Eli was running pre-arrival checks that didn't require his full attention, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence, which was its own kind of data. It was Sierra who broke it, and she did so by asking, without looking up from her device, whether he had ever hauled anything that had turned out to be something entirely different from what the manifest said it was. He told her about the orchids. It was a story he had never told well, because it had so many moving parts and most of them were either illegal, absurd, or both, and the combination made any linear telling of it sound like fabrication. The version he gave her now, in the unhurried way of a man with several hours remaining and an attentive audience, had the quality of a story that had been refined by time into its best shape. It involved a cargo manifest that said architectural components. It involved crates that did not, upon atmospheric equalization in the hold, smell like architectural components. It involved Eli spending 3 days in transit trying to decide whether the smell meant something criminal or something merely eccentric, and arriving at Purdy's station to discover that it meant both simultaneously, that the man who had commissioned the shipment was, in ascending order of improbability, a mid-level freight broker, a person with a warrant in 2 systems, and the founder of a private botanical archive that had been quietly preserving extinct plant species in off-grid facilities for 17 years. The orchids were real orchids. They were also, technically, stolen. They were also, in a third and separate sense, the only surviving specimens of a genus that a mining operation on their home planet had otherwise ended. He said, "I still don't know if I helped a criminal or a conservationist." She said, From what you've described, those categories were performing significant overlap. He said that was exactly it, and the man himself had not seemed troubled by the overlap, which was either the sign of a very good person or a very bad one, and he'd never worked out which. She laughed then, the way she'd laughed at the bureaucratic forms 2 nights before, fully, unmanaged, a sound that the Orventine's cabin absorbed and briefly improved. And she said, in her experience, the most genuinely useful people in any system were invariably the ones for whom the categories had performed significant overlap, because people who fit neatly into a single category tended to lack the range for anything truly necessary. He asked if that was a philosophical position or a professional observation. She said in her case the two were difficult to separate, and moved on before he could ask what her case was, with the practiced fluency of someone who had spent years redirecting conversations without appearing to redirect them. He let it go. He was good at letting things go. It was one of the skills the cargo life developed whether you wanted it or not. What she asked him next, he wasn't expecting. She asked about the routes, specifically what he liked about them, which was a question nobody had ever asked, because the cargo world operated on the assumption that what a person liked about their work was not a relevant category unless it could be expressed as a margin. He found himself answering with a care that the question deserved more than he'd anticipated. He said he liked the silence of long stretches. He said he liked the problem-solving quality of the work, the way each run had its own variables, and you were always doing a version of the same job and a version of a new one. He said, and this was the part he hadn't said to anyone before, because there had never been anyone to say it to who would hear it as the real thing rather than something to be managed. He liked that the work was honest about what it was. Nobody had expectations of it that it couldn't meet. Nobody performed anything for it. It was a thing that needed doing, and he did it, and the doing of it was the whole transaction. She was quiet for a moment after that. Then she said, carefully, that she understood that more than he might expect. He looked at her. She was looking out the forward port, and her expression had the quality of something briefly unconcealed, not sad, not quite, but adjacent to it in the way that certain forms of recognition are adjacent to loss. She had the look of a person who had just said a true thing about themselves using someone else's words because their own had been unavailable. He didn't press it. She didn't elaborate. The Orventine hummed. And then, approximately 40 minutes before docking, Hessen Hub appeared on the forward display as it always did, resolving out of the dark with its rings of amber and white, its infrastructure vast enough to make the mind adjust its scale the way the eye adjusts to bright light. Gradually, reluctantly, arriving finally at a comprehension that still didn't feel entirely adequate. Eli had seen it dozens of times, and it still did that to him. He glanced at Sira and watched her watch it come into view, and whatever had been briefly unconcealed in her expression was gone now, replaced with something composed and settled, the way a person looks when they have returned to the version of themselves the world is expecting. She asked how long until dock. He said 40 minutes. She nodded and returned to her device, and the 40 minutes passed the way good time passes, fully, without rushing it and too fast. Docking at Hessen Hub was a procedural exercise that Eli had performed enough times to do with a portion of his attention, while the rest of him existed elsewhere. And today the elsewhere was occupied by the particular awareness that the thing ending was ending, and that this was a normal feature of things and not a problem, and that Sira came out of the second berth with her bag, which was still unreasonably light, wearing her gray wrap and carrying herself the way she had in Bay 9 at Tethys Minor. Contained, complete, with the specific self-possession of someone who knew precisely how much of themselves to carry visibly. Except she was rested now. That was the difference. At Tethys Minor she had been composed in the way of someone managing something. Now she was composed in the way of someone who had, briefly, put the managing down, and the rest had reached her in the way rest reaches a person when they've stopped pretending they didn't need it. Eli walked her to the hatch. It seemed correct. He was a man who believed in finishing things properly, which was also, he suspected, why he had maintained the Orventine with the attention he did, because the thing deserved to be treated as a complete object rather than a function, and so did a 3-day passage with a person who had been good company. He said the usual things. He said them genuinely, which made them unusual. He hoped the official business sorted itself, the transit forms, the compensation claim, all the procedural machinery she described with such precise and devastating accuracy. He said it in the tone of someone who had listened to the complaints as real complaints and was treating them as such, and she heard that in it, he could tell, because something shifted briefly in her expression. She thanked him. She did it the way she'd done everything across the 3 days, with precision, with weight, without performance. She said the journey had been unexpectedly good, and that the company had made it so, and she said this last part looking at him directly in the manner of someone delivering a verdict they had considered carefully. He said he was glad of it. He said it simply. And then, because he was Eli Vane and he had spent 3 days listening to a person's complaints about navigating the upper levels of interstellar administrative procedure, with the sympathy of a man who understood bureaucratic frustration from well below those levels. He said it in the easy tone of someone finishing a thought. He hoped someone at her level got things sorted faster than regular people did. There had to be an appeals tier for that kind of thing, some channel for people who actually knew how the system worked. She laughed. Not the polite version. Not the managed version. The real one, the one that had first appeared at Form 7 Provisional, and had since become familiar enough that he knew it from the first note of it, full and unguarded, and briefly making her look like a completely different kind of person, or perhaps the same person with all the formal architecture temporarily suspended. Then she looked at him, and her expression did something complicated. It was warm and it was amused, and underneath both of those it was something that took him until much later to name correctly, which was that she was looking at him the way a person looks at a thing that has been genuinely good for them, and that they are about to leave, and holding both those facts at once with the equanimity of someone for whom equanimity was a practiced discipline rather than a natural condition. She said, "You have no idea who I am." He started to answer, something light, something that acknowledged the joke without pulling at it. She was already walking. The arrival terminal took her the way arrival terminals take everyone, immediately, completely, the crowd closing around her as if she had always been part of it, and the gap she'd left on the Orventine was simply a local and temporary condition. He stood at the hatch for a moment. Then he closed the ship and went to log the cargo handover. The first ping arrived while he was still in the queue. Priority flag, immediate response required from Hub Security Level 4. He finished the handover because he was a man who finished things, and then he went. Level 4 had 3 officials and the atmospheric quality of a room where serious things were said with care. The one in the darker uniform, insignia, he didn't recognize, but that his instincts registered the way instincts register things that rank, asked him about his passenger. He told them everything accurately and completely, which took less time than their expressions suggested they'd expected it to, because there was genuinely nothing complicated about his account. He'd found her in a bay. He'd offered her a ride. They'd talked. She'd left. The official in the darker uniform asked whether he had verified her identity before offering passage. He said she'd told him her name was Sira. The official's expression did the thing that professional expressions do when the information they're receiving is significantly outside the range they'd prepared for. It didn't change, exactly. It simply became more deliberate, the way a person holds very still when they're recalibrating. They told him. They told him in stages, and he understood why, because it was the kind of information that needed to be approached gradually, the way you approached a ship with an unstable cargo, not all at once and never from directly ahead. The supreme arbiter of the confederated courts, 300 systems, legal precedent affecting a significant portion of inhabited space, the security apparatus, the transport failure genuine. The 2.5 days they had been looking for her, also genuine. The communication channels she had access to throughout, which could have summoned an official response in 6 hours, which she had chosen not to use. Eli sat with that last part for a long time. He thought about the second berth and the nav charts. He thought about the grain composite and the citrus-adjacent beverage and the morning drink she'd constructed from the galley's available supplies and called an approximation. He thought about Form 7 provisional and the appeals process for Form 7 provisional and the expression on her face when he'd laughed hard enough to set off the proximity sensor. He thought about her asking what he liked about the work, and listening to the answer with the focused attention of someone to whom listening was not a social performance but a genuine practice. He thought about her at the forward port when Hessen Hub came into view, composing herself back into the version of herself the world was expecting, and how he had seen the moment of transition and said nothing because it was not his to say anything about. The non-uniformed official, who had said the least and watched the most, told him that the arbiter had filed a statement on his behalf 2 hours after disembarking, that the statement described him as a man of reasonable character and complete political innocence. That in formal legal language from the office of the supreme arbiter, this was the clearest available civilian clearance. He thought. She did that before they'd even flagged his ship. He thought. She knew they would flag his ship and she dealt with it before he knew there was anything to deal with, which was a thing a person did when they were very accustomed to moving ahead of consequences on behalf of others. He thought complete political innocence. He thought. She meant that as the kindest thing she knew how to say officially. He told the officials he had nothing further to add and asked if he was clear to go. He walked back through the terminal. He didn't look for her. She would be in a secured location by now, surrounded by the apparatus she'd escaped for 3 days, back inside the machinery of what she actually was. She had set precedent across 300 systems. She had also told him with complete sincerity that she couldn't fix the appeals process for Form 7 provisional, and she'd laughed when he'd said that seemed like something she should get on. He had meant it as a joke. He still wasn't sure she'd taken it entirely as one. He reached the Orventine. He stood at the hatch for a moment before going in. 11 years of cargo runs, and he had never once considered what the work looked like from the outside. He had said it to her. The work was honest about what it was. Nobody performed anything for it. And she had said she understood that more than he might expect, in a voice that had carried the specific weight of a person telling the truth about a hunger they didn't usually name. He went inside. The cabin was its standard temperature again, just one body's worth of warmth, the recyclers at their usual register. The second berth had the nav charts back in it, not because he'd moved them but because she'd stacked them neatly against the wall before she left, and on top of the stack she had placed his paperback, which he hadn't noticed was missing until he saw it returned. He picked it up. There was nothing written in it. She wasn't the kind of person who wrote in things that weren't hers, but it had been moved and placed deliberately, and he stood there holding it for a moment with the understanding that some gestures don't require annotation. He sat down at the cockpit console. He pulled up his next route, a standard haul Hessen Hub to the Marrow relay, nothing remarkable. He began filing the departure manifest. He was Eli Vane, cargo hauler, licensed for mid-range freight on 12 registered routes, and the Orventine needed to earn her keep, and there was work to do. He filed the last entry and then sat for a moment before engaging the departure sequence, in the quiet of the docked ship, in the particular silence that follows something that was good and is now complete. Then he engaged the sequence. The port stabilizer hummed back to life, faithful and flat and half a tone off-key. He had no idea who she was. He was glad about that, and he suspected, with a certainty he couldn't have explained to any of the 3 officials on level 4,